These two books, books 2 and 3, are similar, but from the Trojan perspective. And it's a tremendous story of adventure. Aeneas says that they were at Troy. He says, we'd been waging war for a long time. The Greeks appeared to suddenly give up and decide to go home and go away. We look out from across the battlements of our city and we see the Greek ships sailing off and disappearing past the island of Tenedos off on the horizon of the sea. But then some of the Trojans, having ventured nervously out of the city, wandering off through the reeds in a nearby creek, find a man bound with bonds around his ankles and his wrists, shivering in terror. The Trojans cut the gag off his mouth, they cut the bonds from his hands and feet, and they bring him back to the city, and they say, who are you? And he tells them a story. His name is Sinon. He says that he had gotten in trouble with the Greeks, especially Odysseus. They'd been angry with him, they'd accused him of false things, and they'd bound him up and left him behind to die. And he says, those Greeks, they're horrible people, they're wicked men, do anything you like, but don't send me back to the Greeks. And the Trojans, taken in by this lie, which is what it is, say, don't worry, you're in safe hands here, we're all friends. And then they ask this guy, who's been left behind as a trick by the Greeks, as a plant. That's why he'd been hiding in the reeds, you see, he was a plant. So the Trojans say, tell us, sir, why this giant wooden horse that's out here on the beach? The Greeks sail away, leaving this great horse. And now we have the famous story of the Trojan horse, and this is probably the most famous telling in the ancient world. Sinon says the Greeks realized that they had offended the goddess Athena, and they leave the great horse behind as a sacrifice to her to placate her wrath. And the Trojans say, fine, but why is it so big? And Sinon says, oh, that's because we know that if you were ever to take it inside the walls of the city, your city would be unconquerable forever. So we made it too big so he couldn't get inside. Of course, this is all a lie too. The Trojans go, cool, and they start knocking down the walls of the city to drag the horse inside to make their city impregnable. They tear down a portion of the walls and tie ropes around the legs of the horse and prepare to drag it inside. And then 4 things happen. Actually, 3 things happen, and there's a 4th thing I want to throw in. 3 things happen that should have been warnings to the Trojans that this great wooden horse is a trick. The first thing is that the priest of the priest of Neptune, the god of the sea, comes out of the city. His name is Laocoon. He and his 2 sons come out of the city, and he says, don't do it, fellow Trojans, it's a trick. Beware of the Greeks. Be careful of the Greeks, even when they're bringing gifts. And this becomes a famous saying. To this day, you see it repeated now and then. Beware of Greeks, even when they bring gifts. And he throws a spear, and it sticks in the side of the horse, and it kind of makes this hollow thrumming sound as it sticks there vibrating. Well, this gives some of the Trojans pause, but just then 2 great sea serpents come out of the ocean, and they twine themselves around the screaming Laocoon and his 2 sons, devour them, crush them, destroy them, and then the 2 snakes crawl off to the temple of Athena, or rather Minerva, as the Romans call her. And so the Trojans go, oh, Laocoon must have been lying and the gods have destroyed him with snakes, so we don't need to pay any attention to what he said. So they continue to try to drag the horse by these ropes over the rubble of the wall they've just knocked down into the city. But then another thing happens. The daughter of King Priam of Troy, whose name is Cassandra, who is also a priestess of Apollo, comes raving out of the city, tearing her hair with a wild look on her face, and screaming, don't, it's a trick, there might be Trojans inside. And now we have to step back and look at the backstory of Cassandra. Cassandra was one of the many women that Apollo had fallen in love with and pursued and threatened her, until finally in fear she gave in and agreed to sleep with him, and he gave her in return the gift of prophecy. At the last minute, she changed her mind and said, no, I won't sleep with you, it's a wicked thing. And Apollo said, you evil girl, you took back your promise. I can't take back the gift of prophecy I gave you, but I can add to it a curse. No one will ever believe you, though you always prophesy truly. And this, by the way, is a theme in a lot of mythology. The gods can never take back their gifts, but they can add something else. Some people have pointed out that in the New Testament, when the Apostle Paul says the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, that this also is an echo to the idea in Greek mythology that all Hellenists would have been familiar with, that the gods can't take back once they give something, can't take back a gift once given, but they can add to it if they like. So poor Cassandra always tells the truth, and here she's telling the truth. There are, in fact, Trojan warriors hiding inside this great horse, as we all know. But Apollo's curse is that nobody believes her, so the Trojans just laugh and go, oh, it's just Cassandra, whoever believed her anyway, and they ignore a second warning that should have tipped them off to their impending doom. And the third thing is, Aeneas says, as he's telling the story to the Carthaginians and all, he says, we tied ropes around the legs of the horse, and we drug it kind of bumping over the rubble of the city, and we could hear the sound of metal clattering inside it. How does this not tip them off? The sound of metal clattering, like swords and spears. But somehow it didn't dawn on them that that's what they were hearing. They heard metal clattering inside the belly of the horse. And then the fourth thing is not something Aeneas tells, but it's something that we get out of the Odyssey back in Homer's poem. Homer says in his poem that when Telemachus, Odysseus' son, is visiting Menelaus and Helen years after the Trojan War, they're kind of reminiscing about what happened. And Menelaus, who is one of the Greek warriors hiding inside this horse, says to his wife, remember, Helen, what happened? The Trojans were dragging the horse inside the city with us Greeks hiding inside. And you, Helen, you came out of the city and you walked around the horse, staring at the belly of the horse and calling out the names of the Greek warriors inside. And every one of us inside heard the voice of our own wife. And Diomedes, in fact, was so taken in by the sound of his wife that he almost cried out. And then Odysseus, the only one with any presence of mind, clamped his hand over Diomedes' mouth and shouted, or rather whispered, "Be quiet, you fool. Do you really think your wife is in Troy?" So Aeneas doesn't tell us that story, but if we bring that story from the Odyssey into this one, then we have 4 reasons that the Trojans should have been tipped off, 4 omens that should have given away the fact that something untoward was going on. And Aeneas, as he sits in the great hall at the table, sipping his wine, telling the story, pauses thoughtfully and says, Your Majesty, the only explanation I can give for the fact that we didn't believe or even hear any of these omens is that the gods had blinded our minds. It was our day to be destroyed. It was Troy's fated time to fall. So we dragged the horse into the city, and then we all know the story. Aeneas tells it here. He says, we dragged the city in, we partied, we feasted, there were fireworks, confetti in the air. The Greeks were gone. We had the horse inside. What could ever happen? Late at night, we fell asleep, a little heavy with wine. And when we did so, Sinon, that traitor, sneaked up to the horse, opened a trapdoor in the belly. The Greek soldiers inside climbed out. They opened the gates of the city. And the Greek army, which had really been just hiding around the backside of that nearby island, had sailed back, landed. The soldiers sweep into the city through the open gates, and the sack of the city is on. And the rest of Book 2, then, is Aeneas telling this horrifying story to Dido and the other Carthaginians about that night. How the Greeks just rampaged through the city, slaughtering every Trojan they could find, burning houses, burning temples, killing the men, taking the women and children captive for slaves, and so on.